Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about photography and form. On today's episode, I have a completely inspiring conversation with the designer, educator, and photographer Martin Venezky. Martin has operated Appetite Engineers since 1997, where his often experimental kind of typographic work ranges from books to installations to editorial illustrations. And while operating the studio in parallel since 1993, he's taught at the California College of Art in San Francisco and recently has been focusing on his photography work that consists of these really incredible large-scale kind of collages and images. In this episode, Martin and I mostly talk about form and practice. At CCA, he's taught this class on form and image making that has become somewhat well known and I think a sort of borrowed class. I actually had a class that was inspired by Martin's form class when I was in grad school. But we talk about the ideas behind that class and the importance in making and the value in producing images to discover new aesthetics and forms. And I felt like I just came away from this conversation completely inspired and ready to get back to work. We also talk about his career and his time at Cranbrook and how that's influenced all the work that he's done since, whether that is the design work or the teaching or even the photography. And we talk about this new focus on photography. Jon Sueda, who is another former Scratching the Surface guest, recently kickstarted a book of Martin's photo work. And so we talk about that and how that's influencing his practice today. This is one of those really inspiring and encouraging conversations. I've always admired Martin's process and the honestly the fun that it looks like he's having. And I think we captured some of that in this episode. I think you're really going to enjoy it. If you are a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that features behind-the-scenes content, links and articles from former guests about design and writing and criticism, as well as the previews of the upcoming episodes. Scratching the Surface is fully supported through these memberships, so if you like the show and want to help with its ongoing production, I hope that you consider joining. Thank you so much for listening and enjoy this conversation with Martin Venezky. I want to talk about the work that you're doing now and the career that you've had, but I have a couple questions about your education and your background before we kind of get into the stuff that you're doing now. And so you studied, you went to Dartmouth and you got a BA in something called visual studies in the late 70s. Yep. And I want to know what visual studies was and what kind of careers you were thinking about or what that meant to you at the time when you were finishing high school, going to college.
Okay, well, originally, back when I was in high school, my mom wanted me to go to an art school because I was pretty good in art. You know, I could draw, things like that, but I didn't believe that that was a reasonable career. And so I had to be like the parent and say, no,
Right.
mom, because I was also good in math. And so I said, no, I need to go get a math degree. That's really where the future is.
That's so
And
funny.
so, yeah. And so I found a school that allowed for a double major. So when I started at Dartmouth, I was a double major in math and art. Eventually, the math went away. As it moved into pure theory, I became much less interested in it. And so I ended up being there in what they did call visual studies, which was their name for art. But, honestly speaking, at least at the time, it was not the right school to go for that. But I didn't know. I didn't even know about like the possibility of transferring to another school. I was very naive. And so I just figured, well, this is where I am, so I just have to do this. And so I did, and it was. I think at the time the department was pretty antiquated in the fact that even then, I graduated in '79. They did not include photography, for example, as a legitimate art. So there was nothing taught along those lines. It was all, painting and drawing and sculpture and those kinds of things. At the same time, I was also working in the design office there
Mm.
because I kind of knew my way around typography. I knew some things about that just from my own upbringing. And so I was doing design work as a part time job while I was taking the fine art classes.
And was design a word you would have used or know? Like, did you know? You said you were kind of good with typography. You kind of knew your way around that. Did you know that design was a thing that you could do, or how did that kind of uh, come into your life?
Huh. Well, okay, so that all started way back when I was very little. My uncle was a cartographer, a map
Mm.
maker,
Oh, interesting.
and yeah, and that was back when you had to do maps by hand, and so there was inking involved, and
Yeah.
there were sheets of like all the names of all the cities that he had to cut out with adhesive backing and put on the map by hand. And these were for like National Geographic and for textbooks and things. But he also was a calligrapher, and he bought me a like junior calligraphy set. This is back
Mm,
in about like 65, 66, and I still have the speedball book that he gave me, and I just practiced drawing letters because that's what he did. And
right.
so from way back then all the way through, I kind of knew about type and typography, at least in a decorative sense. So I didn't really know about, I at least think at the time when I was an undergrad, design and advertising were pretty much tied together, at least
Hmm.
from my understanding. And I was in a bit of a quandary because I didn't really want to go into advertising,
Yeah.
but I kind of felt like that was the only thing that I would be able to do. So I got an internship at an ad agency
Mm.
in Washington D.C. And there, while I was working there, they had a subscription to Pushpin Graphic,
Okay.
and yeah, and that was the first time I ever saw this magazine or even heard of Seymour Schwast and Milton Glaser,
Hmm.
and I was just stunned. This was an incredible magazine that was all self-generated with friends of theirs, illustration and writing and all kinds of things. And I stole their copies of the magazine
Nice.
because I loved it so much, and that's really what I wanted to do. That was like a dream
Hmm.
to do that, but I couldn't really see a way from like what I was doing at college into making that a career. But
Right.
that was my first really understanding of a kind of design office where they do those sorts of things.
I have like two more questions about that kind of early part of your career, and I don't mean to skim over all of it. Although you did
It's
say before
fine
we
if you
started
do.
recording that it wasn't that interesting. But I was fascinated that you decided to go to Cranbrook for your MFA in the 90s, like in the early 90s. So there was like a 10-year gap between or a little over a 10-year gap between your undergrad and your graduate education. And in an interview I had read with you to prepare for this, you had mentioned that you had actually applied earlier, and the McCoys said, "You're not ready. You know, you're in, but you would benefit later." And so I'm kind of curious about why you applied when you did earlier, and then why you then decided to go back 10 years later. What was kind of happening in your life that you're like, I want this new education?
Right. Okay. So, um, when I was at Dartmouth, there was one of visiting artist there. She taught. Her name is Lorna Ritz,
Mm.
and she was very influential to me. She was a kind of young, wild spirit, which really didn't fit in with the department, and she didn't last there very long. But she had gone to Cranbrook, and
Okay.
she told me about that. I had never heard of the school before. And at the time, there really weren't that many graduate programs around in design, but she knew I
Hmm.
was interested in that kind of thing. And her like last words to me before I graduated were go to Cranbrook.
Oh, wow.
So Yeah, and I'm one of those people who just like, okay, she said to
Yeah.
go to Cranbrook's, I guess that's what I'll do.
Right.
And but after I graduated, I came home I lived in the Maryland suburbs of Washington D.C.
Okay.
And my mom said, okay, now you have to get a job. Here are the classifieds. Go find a job. I didn't
Mhm.
know anything about like using your college connections or developing that sort of thing. I figured, okay, when you graduate, that's what you do. And so I had a
Right.
series of horrifying jobs, mostly through the government or government contracts. And then
Okay.
I decided around 1980, that was just a year, to like, let me apply to Cranbrook and just see. So I did, and I went out there for an interview, and Kathy McCoy was there, and they actually were willing to let me in. They accepted
Mm.
me, but she said I'd have to do a pretty intensive reading program over the summer to get me ready because where I had gone undergrad, there was no kind of theory, there was no thinking about
Right.
design at all.
Right.
And I decided that I wasn't ready for all that. I thought maybe I better like keep my career as it may be
Mhm.
going for a while. And then, that just kept going. And then I eventually moved to San Francisco and I just had a series of jobs that I did not like at all. And I started seeing, I was doing design and it was very pedestrian. It was like
Mm.
25% off coupons, things like that,
Right. Right.
believe it or not. And while that was happening, I started seeing this other kind of design happening. This is right when Emigre was
Mhm.
beginning,
Mhm.
and David Carson's work. You start seeing that in magazines, and I thought that's where I want to be. But there was no way to get from where I was doing this very mundane pedestrian work to this interesting work. There was no way
Mhm.
to just jump over,
Yeah.
and I felt pretty forlorn. I was paid pretty well, and I felt like, oh, I lost my opportunity. That time in 1980 was my big chance. Now I'm too old. That was all in my mind.
Mhm.
But then, but then, really, one day, sitting in my apartment in San Francisco, it just struck me. And I remember exactly like where I was sitting that maybe you could still go.
Mm.
And the next day, I called up Cranbrook and asked if they accepted older students. And they said,
Mhm.
yes, of course. In fact, most of our students are older. At this point, I was only like 30. It's not like,
Yeah.
I
Right.
was 70 or
Right.
something. And so I applied. I applied right away. But I didn't get in because at that time, then my portfolio was filled with coupons, right?
Oh,
And sales
right.
kits. So I had to take a whole year and take night classes, which I did down in Santa Cruz. So I had to drive an
Mm.
hour down to
Oh,
take
geez.
classes at night and then come back, do the homework, and go to work. I did that for a year to build up a portfolio. In the meantime, one of the classes I took was a weekend workshop with Lucille Tanasis, who was here in San Francisco at the time. And I met her and we talked, and she had gone to Cranbrook. And so I was able to kind of scrape together a halfway decent portfolio, and she agreed to write a letter on my behalf, and I finally got in. So,
Mm.
and then I never looked back, let's just say.
Yeah, I mean it definitely seems like Cranbrook was a big turning point in your career, but also in kind of shaping how you think about all the work that you've done since. I think it's interesting. I didn't realize that you were in San Francisco before you went to Cranbrook, and so you were close to Rudy and Susanna. Did you know they were that close and that like that was happening right there?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that happened because the people I was working around knew how I was kind of feeling about my job.
Okay. Hmm.
And they said, there's this lecture happening at CCA, which is the school where I actually teach now.
Hmm.
And my job was in Oakland, and this was at their Oakland campus. And they said, you should go see this guy. I didn't know who it was. I knew nothing about Emigre at the time.
Okay.
Uh, but they said, why don't you just go to that lecture? And so I did, and it was Rudy and Susanna, and they gave this lecture, and it just blew my mind. It just, about like what was
Yeah.
happening in this whole world. And so I remember I ran out the very next day to find the latest copy of Emigre magazine,
Yeah.
and it happened to be the one that featured Ed Fella and Pete Schroeder's. And I remember getting the magazine and opening it up and looking at Ed's work, and I just didn't get it. I just,
Yeah.
it took me, I had to read all the essays and things, but I just thought, oh my God, here's this guy who's like doing everything wrong. What's happening in design?
Yeah.
It became this kind of thing where I didn't know the theory behind all of this, but
Hmm.
what I knew is I wanted to know. And so and that all that convinced me that I wanted to go to the what I perceived was the most difficult, challenging place I could go. And that was Cranbrook, because that's where these people were coming out of. And I wanted to understand all this stuff. And so that just made me very hungry for it. And I remember I wrote Rudy a letter because I was trying to decide where to go to school for sure.
Hmm.
And he wrote me back. I still have the letter saying,
Oh.
whatever you do, if you go to grad school, don't go to grad school in design. Do it in any other
Mm.
subject except design. And I'm kind of glad I didn't listen to him.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you I have two questions about Cranbrook. I mean, I could ask you a lot of questions about
Yeah,
Cranbrook,
yeah.
but I have two questions kind of hearing you talk about this, and they're both about the McCoys and about Kathy telling
Hmm.
you, that you should wait. And I do you think that she was right, that you ended up having a better experience there waiting? And then I would love to hear about her influence on you and the way you think about design. And the reason I ask that is I feel like Kathy McCoy is such a does not get the credit that she deserves in shaping
Mm.
so much of how we talk about design today. And that kind of 90s era, a lot of that was coming from your what you said. It was coming from Cranbrook. It was coming from the way she was teaching. What was that like, kind of being there, and the influence that she had on you?
Hmm. Um, so, to answer your first question, I suspect she was right. Although, I think that she was willing to have me go if I
Hmm.
did all of this reading ahead
Right,
of
right.
time, and I suspect that she was probably right because she kind of knew what I was missing. It was my own decision not to like spend the summer reading and
Right,
trying to
right.
prepare. But she had a point. Although it wasn't like then in the ensuing 10 years, I read up on design. I didn't. I should have, but I just kind of erased that whole chapter, figuring, no, I made this
Mm,
other decision and that's my
mm,
path.
I see. Yeah.
So had I like kind of pushed her to give me a reading list, I suppose then I might have tackled it, but I didn't even do that. So
Hmm.
that was a bad thing on my part. Um, but when I finally did go, um, it was a really interesting experience because in many ways Kathy stayed in the background. She
Mm,
you know she was less of a overt teacher as much as she was a facilitator, I felt.
mm,
And because I was an older student, then I was maybe not, I think I might have been the oldest student there at the time. I felt much more of a rapport with her because I was very self-motivated and self-directed. And so she was really good at suggesting things to read, suggesting artists to look up, that kind of thing. And of course, this was at a pre-internet time.
hmm.
So any names that you heard, any ideas, you had to go look them up in the library and try to find something about them, right? So
Hmm.
so each thing was an effort. You had to kind of cross a threshold and put in the effort to look these people up. And I think all of that really helped. A lot of it was like books that were circulating around, and then they would land in your lap, and you would read it, and you could take from it what you
Mm,
wanted.
hmm.
All of that kind of thing was really was really how she approached it. And so we got along really well, I felt. And that wasn't true for everybody. You know,
Hmm.
she really, I think if you were self-driven and self-motivated, she was behind you all the way. But if you seemed to take advantage of the time there and didn't really
Uh,
apply yourself, there wasn't a lot she could do for you. And so it was a good place for me. It's not necessarily a good place for everybody, but it worked well. And then she was really helpful. Once I graduated, she's the one that kind of hooked me up with the people of Speak Magazine who were looking for a
mm.
designer, and she brought us together, and that kind of helped me start to get that kind of work and to do the kind of design that I'm doing today.
And did you feel like that, going to Speak Magazine and then the career that you've had since, does that or I mean, let me be more specific. The career that you've had as a designer since, did that feed that kind of itch or that interest that you had pre Cranbrook of the type of work that you were interested in and wanted to do? Because it seems like what you were kind of talking about of wanting to do before Cranbrook, that's what you've been able to do.
Yeah, but the funny thing is, all I really wanted was to get a better job.
Mm.
I was
Okay.
perfectly happy. What I wanted to do was just work at one of the known design
Oh, I
firms
see.
in San
Got it.
Francisco. And I wasn't there to kind of become an independent spirit. In fact, because my dad worked for himself,
Right.
and it created a lot of havoc in the family. I just knew in my head I never want to run my own business because it's filled with turmoil. That's all I knew, and
Yeah.
that was the absolute last thing I wanted to do. So when I came back from Cranbrook, though, I had a very strange idiosyncratic portfolio, and I would go on interviews or drop my portfolio off at any of these other companies, places that I wanted to work, and got zero response. I
Mhm.
think the problem they saw was that the work at this point was so kind of self driven and personal. And most design firms, little did I know this, but they're looking for people who can adapt themselves to the style of the person in charge of the firm,
Mhm.
which makes total sense. And I think they looked at me and saw I was older, I had this style, and I think all they imagined was there would be a lot of fights. And
Right.
so why bring on this guy who already has his own thing and would not be willing to just take orders? Although in my mind, that would have been fine. So I ended
Mhm.
up pretty much going on my own, eventually, by default. I mean, that's kind of the only thing I could do.
Can you talk more about that? I think what you just said is exactly right and feels like my experience, and it feels like the
Mhm.
experience of that many of my students have, who when they kind of ask me about looking for jobs, is that they spend their time in school. I spent my time in school developing a personal voice, a personal style, doing work that was kind of coming out of the my own kind of personal experiences, my students doing work coming out of their experiences, and then that weird balance that you have to have of bringing yourself into the work, but also knowing that you have to get jobs, or that you might have to work for somebody where you kind of have to kind of plug in and adapt. And you said that the only way that you could do that was to work on your own, but you've been able to kind of work with clients, and I think your your work is fairly diverse. And I guess maybe even as a teacher, as you're talking to students, how do you think about that as somebody who's kind of encouraging experimentation and expression and kind of trying different things, knowing you also have to get a job sometime? You know what I
Yes, you
mean?
do. Right, and well, one thing to keep in mind is most of the work I do now is book design. That's the primary thing, and
Mm-hmm.
in book design, you have to be very careful. That's where you really have to balance the
Yeah, yeah.
needs of the publisher, the author, and the need as a designer to kind of create a special language to go with it. So I think that's really a good test of how to
Mm,
balance that all and how to kind of dial your ego down a bit so that the text and can shine through. Um, but I think what do I tell my students? Well, okay, a couple of things that I do explain that one of the challenges is getting to develop a process in which you can bring a client along with you if you're going to
mm,
try an experimental process. And
mm,
a lot of that kind of happened accidentally, because really the first clients I had was basically Speak Magazine. I mean, I did some other work before that, uh, but with Speak, the client was the publisher, and so that wasn't a problem. But after that, I started working with outside clients, and I just started developing a process. And the only thing I knew how to do was to do kind of experimental work. A lot of it was working with photography in an experimental way, but
mm-hmm.
bringing the client in at the very beginning. So when we set up an odd kind of photo shoot, as soon as we got the images back, bring the client in and let them see even before I know what we're going to do with them,
Mm-hmm.
as a way of getting them excited about it, allowing the work to be collaborative, and also giving them the freedom to say, that's too far, or
Right.
you're kind of missing some aspect. And so I think by bringing them in all through those stages, I think it helps create a kind of experience where they're enjoying the process alongside you. They're not just saying, come back in a month with three options, because that's
Right.
not how I like to work. That's how a lot of it is taught. And I understand a lot of clients demand it that way. But when a client approaches me, I pretty much tell them, this is the way I work, and they seem quite open to it, right? And
Yeah.
that it makes it I think, a lot of fun to be involved with them all along the way.
I want to keep talking a little bit about teaching now that you were kind of talking about the things that you tell your students, because that's like this other strand of your career, um, going back a couple decades now. How did you start teaching?
Okay, well, as you may be noticing, as this interview proceeds, most things. I mentioned this before. I just gave a talk last week where I point out that I've never been able to steer my career in
Mm.
any kind of path that I have in mind. Everything from not ever wanting to work by myself, not
Right.
ever wanting to run my own business, and at the time, not ever wanting to teach.
Oh, interesting.
Things just kind of like land in my path, and I just sort of follow them. I don't. And it's
Yeah.
been really weird. But now that I kind of look back at a lot of it, every time I think that I'm now going to move in this direction, it never goes the way I plan. And I don't know if it's that I'm flexible or gullible or just
Right. Oh, I
just
love that.
something gets
That's so funny.
lost. Yeah, and so the teaching thing. Okay, so this all began at Cranbrook again. Uh, One thing that Kathy McCoy really pushed is that when you graduate, she tells everyone, or she told everyone when she was there, that she wanted everyone at some point to teach. And a
Mm,
lot of it had to do with bringing the ideas of Cranbrook out into the world. And
mm,
somehow, by getting these people on different faculties and different schools, that way of thinking will start to weave its way into the general way of looking at design.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think she was very, very successful in that. In that,
Yeah.
there are
Yeah.
many teachers with that background all over the place.
Yeah.
And so, when she told me that, I just sort of like gulped and thought, "There's no way," because I was a very, very shy, introverted person. I
Mm.
could barely ever stand up in front of a room to say anything. But I
Mm.
think at Cranbrook, we had a couple of group projects, and she saw that I was pretty good at sort of organizing the group and kind of giving an overview and getting that together. And she did take me aside and say that she particularly wanted me to consider teaching. And
Oh,
so it's
interesting.
like, oh no. So right after I graduated, Lucille Tanasis, who I had met,
Hmm.
a while back, we had stayed in touch. And she asked if she said there's an opening at CCA, California College of the Arts. At the time, College of Arts and Crafts,
Mm.
working in undergrad teaching typography. And I thought, okay, well, this is, once again, here is the world telling me what I'm going to do now. Instead of saying, no, teaching is not really the thing I want to do, I just said, okay. And so I started by co-teaching because I was too scared to do it on my own. But pretty quickly did it, and I have found, and it's to this day, that the classroom is one of the places that I'm most comfortable of any,
Mm.
besides my own studio, in that when I am there I feel completely at ease, in
Yeah.
command. I can even walk into classrooms where I've never been before when I visit schools and I have to talk to the students. I have absolute comfort there, and I would have never, ever, ever imagined that in my life
Yeah.
before. But here it's been. This is my 27th year teaching, and it's become such a natural thing for me.
Yeah, I'm the same way when you were talking about the kind of comfort that you feel in the classroom, and that completely surprised me the first time I did it. It was something I always was interested in. I thought,
Mm.
especially, when you're like an arrogant undergraduate student watching a teacher, you're like, I could do this.
Oh,
But I also had some interest in thinking like, this seems interesting. But I had no idea that as soon as I walked into the room, that it was like, oh, this is actually what I'm supposed to be doing. This is the thing
yeah,
about, this is the thing that connects all the stuff about design that I'm interested in. So
yeah.
I know exactly what you mean. And the reason I wanted to talk to you about teaching is because it does seem like it's a big part of your work, but it also, from the outside, as someone who's kind of watched your career for a while, it seems like being in the classroom has actually influenced all the other work too. And I think the more personal work that you do, the kind of formal experiments, the photography, the drawing, that all seems like uh, stuff that comes out of the classroom, comes out of that kind of experimentation. Do you have thoughts on how being a teacher has actually kind of changed how you think about being a designer?
Oh, definitely. Particularly in the kind of work that I'm doing now. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Originally, a lot of it was me projecting my way of thinking about design onto the classroom, right? And trying to
Mm-hmm.
get the students to understand about self-generated work, about personal work, about bringing in their own voice and all of that. But one class in particular called Form Studio is something that began. Well, we just had our 20th year. We had a show with
Mm.
Jon Sueda organized an
Yeah.
exhibition of 20 years of this one particular class. And this is how it started, because this class it became very influential in my understanding about design and visual culture, and influential in the work I'm doing now. I had been teaching a typography class. It was an advanced type class
Mm.
at CCA. And what I found, one of the projects that I would give the students was they have to find a location, or I give them a location in San Francisco, and they have to go there and explore it, and make recordings, photograph it, and all of that stuff. and then do a poster about it.
Mm,
And
mhm.
so the first couple of weeks are the exploratory stage. And they all went out and they were incredibly enthusiastic. They brought back great photographs and like sound recordings and transcriptions and all kinds of things. They were just so into it. And then at a certain point, I have to say, okay, now it's time to design the poster. And
Mm.
suddenly the air just left the room. Everyone, it became dreary.
Yeah.
The work became like nightmarishly difficult. Everything became forced and ugly. And I just couldn't, I wondered, like, what happened? Where did the spirit go? And and it made me just wonder what would happen if I had a class where I never ever said, now it's time to make a poster. That it
Right.
just was a series of explorations and discoveries and all of that. And so I created this kind of experimental class as it was an elective kind of class. Uh, Ultimately, it's called Form Studio, and that's what I tried. I thought I had no idea it was going to work. I really was afraid that like maybe after 4 weeks they would just get bored and I'd have to come up with another project. But I
Yeah.
thought let's just give it a try. And so I just gave everybody these basic materials, just this cheap stuff that I would buy at drugstores and things. And I gave them that and had them like start to explore,
Mm.
and it was really exciting. So these were all upper level undergrads, and what I found was they were so hungry because all of their work pretty much at that point was design projects where there was an imaginary client, or they were doing
Mm, mhm,
logos and identities, they were
mhm.
doing posters for movies, all of this. And finally someone was just kind of setting them free, and
Yeah.
they just ate it up, and I was just astonished. The very first class, I still have a lot of the work. I was so amazed by it that I thought I need to make a book about this, and so I photographed like all their work,
Mm.
and they're all in slides, and so I have a lot of the original work from that very first class because it was so amazing to me. And they just took the work and they moved, and they did some photography, but at that time this was pre-digital camera,
Mhm.
so photography was expensive and time consuming because you had to process the film or send it
Yeah.
out and then get it back. And so a lot of them went immediately to drawing and printmaking and painting and all of these other strategies. So photography was just one thing among many, and it was just this exuberance and willingness to go deeper and deeper. The other aspect of the class, though, is I had no idea how to talk about this stuff. I had never
Right.
taught abstract stuff. Everything used to have, there was a
Right.
concept and all. And so suddenly I
Mhm.
was forced to develop and learn how to create a dialogue that was both motivating to the students and dealt with the work on its own terms, as opposed to its effectiveness as a communication
Right.
or its response to a client. Suddenly,
Yeah.
those were not part of the equation. So it was a real learning process for me and for the students. And after like a year and a half, we moved it to the brand new grad program, which was begun by Lucille Tanasis again. See, she figures a lot in my story.
Yeah.
And I worked with her to develop the original curriculum, and I proposed that we make Form Studio the beginning studio class of the graduate program.
Mm.
And that's where it started, and in the graduate level, and that's where it is to this day. So like 18 years later, it is still the opening class for the graduate program. But here's the difference: is that at a graduate level, suddenly you get the skeptics, because these are, when you're
Mm.
dealing with undergrads, right? This is their
Right.
fourth year, and they're hungry for this. But grads at the beginning, they come in, they've been working in the world, they're making a big investment both in time and money, and they are, a lot of them are looking at, I'm going to go to grad school because I want to change the world, right? I'm tired of
Mhm.
designing in a boring design office, just like I was, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
I want to do something important in design. I want to learn. And then here it is, their very first studio class. I give them a box of paper clips and say, go explore this. You can imagine how skeptical they
Yeah.
are. It's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
wait a minute, I'm not in kindergarten. What's going on here? So I have to change my whole way of working with the class to convince them, to sell them on the idea that it's not about learning to work with paper clips, right? That is not what I'm trying to
Mhm.
teach you.
Mhm.
It's about exploring, developing a dialogue, learning to use your work as a generator of more work without being told. And learning how to be self-critical, because once you're out in the world, it's really important for you to be your toughest critic. So all of this stuff, and it begins the kind of conversation about design that goes beyond, again, clients and communication, and into the idea of how visual material works on the eye, how we
Right.
respond to abstraction, that's something that might make us feel uncomfortable, or make us might feel unbalanced, or
Yeah.
make us desire to head towards it. These kinds of things, which are very much a kind of gestalt looking at design and these visual strategies. So by doing that, and then what happened for me is I decided at one point that I needed to do the same process myself.
Yeah.
So I've been using photography a lot in my work, um, but I decided to now, can I start just using photography as a way to just create work? And there were a lot of steps along the way, but eventually I had a sabbatical year where I really put myself through this process pretty seriously. And now, one thing I make my students do, I didn't do it first, but very quickly, I've made them work without color. So everything is
Mm.
black and white. It's a
Mhm.
combination of photography and drawing. I found that what happened was, once we got cheap color printers, everything was in color, and so everything could kind of look cool.
Oh,
And
right.
yeah, and bright
Yeah.
colors often masked really kind of bad work. And
Right.
so I made them discount color, um, so that we could really focus on the form, and they didn't have color to fall back on. So I decided, when I was working, I needed to put myself through that same process. So I got rid of all color in my photography work. That was only supposed to be for a couple of months, just to see what it was
Mm.
like. But that was about 3 years ago, and I do
Yeah.
color. I do some of my work is in color, but the kind of hardcore photo work that I do is mostly in black and white.
I love everything about what you just said. I want to talk about the photography in a second, but I have a
Mhm.
couple I have like a couple thoughts that maybe will turn into a question. I just kind of want to see what you think about a couple of things. I'm going to try to organize this a bit, because I really like everything that you just said talking about that form studio class. I was just nodding vigorously in agreement. Um, Something I've been thinking about, and I've been talking about this with my students a little bit too, is how the word experimental, when we talk about experimental graphic design, for
Hmm.
example, has kind of devolved into just anything that is not modernist is now called
Yeah.
experimental. And I think a lot of what we call experimental design now actually isn't experimental at all. A lot of it actually kind of looks the same, and the processes are the same. And so, what I like about that class, what I like about that process, is that it's kind of taking back this word experimental and is actually using experiments very literally. And I like that that's happening through these formal experiments. And I feel like I am probably more guilty of this than anybody, is that I can sometimes lean too far on like the theory side or the concept or the idea, that the form itself actually gets lost or degraded in some way. And so I really like this idea of just focusing on form and thinking about what forms we can create and how we can experiment with form. And I, I guess like the so that's just me just saying I love what you were saying and that I agree. Um, I'm curious. It's interesting for me to hear you say that, you were kind of doing this and then realizing, hey, I have to do this myself also. And I was kind of curious if you could talk a little bit more about that, because I'm also always telling my students, to be experimenting with things, to be kind of like trying things, to like kind of just constantly be making things. That's how I was when I was a student. Um, I'm embarrassed to admit, I don't do that very much now, and I want to get back to that. I want to kind of get back to that almost like novice or amateur, or just I'm just gonna play, even, I'm just gonna experiment. And what was that like for you when you kind of then got into that process, or how did you, make time for that, or say, hey, this is something that I have to do for myself.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first, let me talk a bit about what you said before, because I think
Mm,
it's really significant, um, about experimentation. Yeah,
mm,
I think that what started to happen, and it happened at CCA a lot, is that when students were told to do something experimental, what they were really being told is to go wild or go crazy,
mhm,
and
mhm.
that is so not, to me, what experimentation is. The
Right,
problem is that experimentation, in order to really be effective, requires analysis, not just the making, but then the inspecting of the making and the talking about the making and the critique of the making. And that's the part that's always missing in this, because most people don't know how to talk about that kind of work, except that's cool, or keep
right,
going,
right,
or
right.
wow, that's crazy. And those aren't effective. Those aren't valuable
Yeah.
ways of talking about it. And so I really had to do a real deep dive in understanding the ways of discussing this work as a series of experiments that keep generating further ones. And the only way they can generate further work is by looking at the work, making an assessment, deciding which things are successful, which things aren't successful, understanding why you find them successful or unsuccessful,
Mhm,
and then
mhm.
taking those bits and moving them into the next set of studies that you do. And that to me
Right.
is really a serious experimental process that becomes self-generating. The work, once you start getting into that process, the work generates itself. It becomes a machine that will provide you with more and more things to look at and things to think about. If you don't do that, you get used up. The work, you start to run out of ideas and you hit a wall and everything goes blank, because you have not
Right.
developed a process that allows the analysis to then move you forward. Now, I really think that formal research is a kind of design research, and I feel
Mhm.
really frustrated when people talk about design thinking and design research, but they almost never apply it to the idea of formal investigation, because that's really that's so key to it all. And I feel, and I've felt this way for a really long time, that concept is way overrated, because you can
Mm.
have a great concept, but if you can't attach a form to it or let a form generate from it that
Right.
is compelling in one way or another, or involves a way of talking about it, then the concept dies. And
Mhm.
I really think the two can go work hand in hand. A concept is formed as you're working on the form. It
Right.
isn't that the concept, the clever concept comes first, and then you just flip through catalogs of potential form to as a container for
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
and then you're
Yeah.
done. And I
Right.
think that's the way a lot of design is taught, and that's the way a lot of students start to work, especially when you can kind of zip through lots of form online. And that's
Right.
why I think once you teach students how to generate form from nothing, then they have this great power that they're never going to be reliant on what happens to be cool at the moment. Because when I look at the work that the students do in the form studio, none of it is current or not current. It's not hip or not hip. It starts to feel completely outside of time. And so I
Right.
really look at Form Studio as a way of looking at design as an art practice, as opposed
Mm.
to a commerce practice. And
Mm.
I think that that is a really important thing. And in an art practice, everything you do builds on the things you've done before. It becomes a
Right.
continual set
Right.
of sketches, studies, experiments, some of which get realized into full on final works, others that just keep moving along in the background. And so I think starting to see your work as the way an artist also works, including the kind of critique that an artist does, I think is a really healthy and valuable way of understanding how design works. That it doesn't always
Yeah.
have to be in service of a client. And I think starting to see that, and a lot of that really developed through this class I taught when I had to start doing this. I
Yeah.
could start taking this into my own practice. And then can I start to make even client work that I do part of an art practice and not just I'm here to serve the client. And so that's part of developing a methodology where I can bring the client in and they start to get
Mm,
involved in what I'm doing for them as a form of art practice and not just I'm here to solve your problem, here's a solution. And
right.
that's just the way I see it. And so, what I want with my students is I'm not trying to convince them that this is the way to work at all. All I want to do is to introduce them to this as a possibility and give them this freedom and chance to taste this and see what it's like. If they want to carry this forward into their own work, whether in school or out, terrific. They now have this tool in their toolbox. A
Right.
lot of the students kind of, well, this is really not for them. They're much more interested in other aspects of design, and that's totally fine. I just think it's really critical, particularly at a grad level, to allow students to see what this is like to work this way. And then I show them
Yeah.
my own work to say, I practice what I preach. Here's the kinds of things I'm doing. Even I show them, professional work that I'm doing that is still in early stages and explain,
Mm.
this is how I'm bringing the exactly what you're doing in the classroom into what I'm doing.
And that connects to the photography work a little bit too, which I do want to talk about as we kind of head into the end of the conversation, because I
Sure.
got the new book, What I Know About Photography, that you and John put together,
Mhm.
and I read it, and basically as soon as I finished, I emailed you to say I want to talk to you for the podcast. But the something that struck me in the book is I did not realize that you were approaching your photography work as a kind of purely art practice, that you were kind of going to photography shows, you were kind of getting critiqued, that you saw this as a completely different thing, and that you wanted the photography work to stand on its own, not to be I am a designer who does photography, but that this could be photographic work. Can you talk about why you want to do that, and also how why you're kind of doing that now, despite the fact that photography has been a part of your entire life? What recently has changed that has kind of made you make that turn?
Huh. Well, okay. This is yet another one of those accidents that like
Right, of
landed on
course.
my doorstep.
Right.
So it really the kind of setup of how this really began is I decorated my office with photographs because I would use photography in a lot of magazine work, illustration work that I would
Mm-hmm.
do. I would experiment with type and the camera, these kinds of things. And what would happen is I would end up with folders filled with studies that would just live
Mm.
on my desktop, of my laptop, and I would never be able to look through them again. And as it happens, when I had to move to a new studio, at that time, I found out that I thought that getting prints of all of these photographs was going to be really expensive. But then I found that Walgreens, and this is I guess this could be a plug for Walgreens. If you wait for a sale, their online photo service, you can get prints for 9 cents a piece. And
Mm.
so I just went nuts, and I like emptied out all the folders into 4x6 formats, and I
Mm.
sent thousands and thousands of these files through the online service to get prints made, and it was fantastic. And I just used my whole studio to pin these up on the walls, and that
Mm.
way I could kind of see all of these studies, and I could kind of swim in this work, which really helped me when I'm trying to think of new things. I can look back at this whole catalog of of studies that I did and
Right.
help come up with, the next thing I want to do. I like to have everything out in the world and not hidden away. And so what happened was Jon Sueda, he was curating his show All Possible Futures.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, and he came by my office just to look for some design work that might want to be in the show. And so this was the first time he saw the studio with all this photography up on the wall. And he just kind of jokingly said, "Oh, it would be kind of cool if we could just take one of these walls and put it in the gallery."
Yeah.
Ha 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 ha. Well, okay. Then that turned into, well, why don't we do that? And so I just decided, instead of just transferring the photos from the wall to the gallery, I wanted to do it all new. I wanted to take pictures specifically for this, just as a challenge to myself. And so
Hmm.
this ended up being the very first time any of my photography was put out into the world, not as a client based thing, but just
Mm.
as its own work, within a gallery space or in the public in general. And so it was a test for me about, can I, because I had to shoot thousands and thousands of pictures and just bring them to the gallery and do it on site. So that was always a challenge. It was kind of a game and kind of a dare to see if I could make it work. And it was very exciting, and I was really happy with the results. And that then led to other opportunities, and then through many different steps it led to the kind of work that I'm doing now, which still is based on the same thing of pinning the the actual prints up with push pins, working the arrangement out that way, and then recreating that with the digital files. So I still work the
Mm.
same way I did when I put the pictures up on my wall for private. I need that component that's analog, that these have to come back as prints, as rectangular pieces of paper that I
Right.
then have to deal with as the physicality of it, and then be faithful to that when I retranslate it digitally. So that got me interested in the idea of photography in a gallery, and I had never really thought about it in a serious way. I mean, I've always been somewhat interested in photography, but I started to be really interested in this process. And I was just kind of working on my own in this realm of creating these things as I started to move into black and white. And I had no way of judging, is what I'm doing even valid in the photo world or not,
Mm. Hmm.
And so I started to just take some of the work. I would invite some people over who were more in photography and just have them come over to my studio and talk to me about it, because I didn't even know what the language of people within photography was as opposed to
Right.
design. And
Right.
I felt that the problem I had is that anyone in design will look at it and say, "Hey, that's great, that's cool," and they would talk about it as like design. And I was interested in what the difference is between them, and there is quite a bit of difference. And then I also felt like I didn't want to be considered a dilettante. And I feel that in
Mm.
general,
Hmm.
designers keep getting caught in this realm. Designers, have, as you know, have the ability to work in many different media.
Hmm.
They can work in music, they can work in film and video, but what I find is that very often they get perceived as dilettantes by the
Right.
people who've really put their heart and soul into these other media. Designers usually waltz in when there is software that makes doing it easy. And
Right.
so, like, designers all
Right.
become musicians when you can do the whole thing on your laptop, but they never studied music. They never worked, right? They were never critiqued within music programs. They never had to really struggle with
Right.
how to
Yeah.
put it together. And so what started to happen is, with the photography, as soon as I told anyone that I'm really a designer, boom, the immediate response in their mind was that I just got myself a camera and took a few
Mm.
pictures, and look at me, I'm a photographer now. And so there was a real resistance, because whenever
Huh.
designers do this, they always just assume, oh, right, designers always think it's easy. It's like, and it's probably happened to you too. It's happened to me
Oh
where
yeah. Yeah.
a fine artist has just learned InDesign, And now they think they're a
Yeah.
graphic designer, right?
Oh
Oh,
yeah.
you just make a
Yeah.
rectangle and you put type in it. Look, I'm a designer. And you think like how insulting that is for people who studied design. Well, the same thing happens when designers do that in
Yeah.
other pursuits.
Yeah.
And I think designers often just pay no attention to that. And that's why a lot of designers who are doing, I think, really interesting work in these other fields are completely unknown in those fields, that it doesn't matter. And I really wanted to be part of the conversation in photography. I didn't want to be just lumped on the side as someone who just happens to do this work. I really wanted it to be, I wanted harsh critique because from my teaching, I understood how important really serious critique is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is the only way to get better. I really believe that it's almost impossible to completely get better just from your own willpower. You need critique within that world. And I find that so many designers who work, like who maybe are creating music, they will not take their work. And I always encourage my students to do this: take it to one of the music instructors and have them talk
Mm,
to you seriously
mm,
about it. Some of my students are interested in making video, and I tell them I really think that you should get as one of your advisors someone in the film program,
right.
because
Yeah.
they can talk to you within the context of that. Now, the interesting thing about this whole way of thinking is that it goes right back to Cranbrook, because
Mm,
at Cranbrook, every at the end of every year, you put all of your work in a room, and the instructors, and at Cranbrook there's only one instructor per field,
right.
per
Right.
discipline. They all come in and they talk to you about the work, but it's always from their perspective. So you get someone from metals and you get someone from sculpture talking to you about your design work. And at first, we in design felt very put off by this because, oh, none of these people understand design. How dare they come in and start talking to us about type? What do they know? But
Hmm.
really, that kind of way of learning to look at your work through different frameworks and listen, instead of feel like you have to defend it, listen to the way they talk about your work, was incredibly valuable to me. Even I know I did this huge project at Cranbrook that involved doing these type rubber stamping type onto bed sheets. I'm not going to
Mm.
get into the details of it, but it involves fabric. And so the instructor from the fabric department came in, and he just tore me to shreds, because
Mm.
he kind of, this is what he said, and it's resonated to this day. It's like, how dare you just take up working with textiles, knowing that there's a whole textile department here with people who are devoted to it, who could
Mm.
really talk to you about it and really let you understand how to work with textiles, what the meaning is, and really enrich this. You just think it's as easy as getting a bunch of bed sheets and sticking type on it and thinking that you're now a textile designer. And it's like, oh my God. And I was just totally rattled by that. But he was absolutely right. Absolutely right. And so that has stayed with me forever. And that's why when I do the photo work, I really want to talk to people in photography and have them talk to me at that level. Even if it's, this stuff is terrible, whatever they have to say, I really respond to that and really respect that, and take it very, very seriously when they do that.
So I wanna kind of like bring this back to the design work
Sure.
itself. And I'm sorry that I keep kind of like asking you these questions in pairs. um, but I'm interested in the relationship between your design work and your photography work historically, and how you saw those two things, because you were talking about you would like take photos for kind of studies or kind of to be a type of research to the design. But now that you're thinking about photography as a fine art practice, is there a relationship to the design work or the client work that you're doing, or how do those start to talk to each other?
Very much so, and that was I wasn't sure that that was going to happen. So like you said, it's always been in there. It was always a process that I would use, a methodology when I wanted to do type that really got going with Speak Magazine. Although
Hmm.
the relationship of photography and design happened quite a bit earlier. For one thing, my dad was a wedding photographer, so we always had a dark room at home. In fact, I kind of assumed that every household had a dark room because we kind of grew up with one, and that just was a natural component of
Hmm.
being at home. And so I already was somewhat familiar with that whole realm. But when I went to when I went to Cranbrook, you kind of have to. One thing that you find out very quickly is that you have to come up with your own topics that you're interested in. It's like you have a couple of
Right.
assignments, but generally most of the work you have to decide. Well, I thought, well, okay, how about photography? Because I know a little bit about that. I know what my dad did. So I started looking for books about photography, and I found that all of the books in the library about photography were all theoretical, and none of them dealt with the kind of work that my dad did, which was it was photography, right? And it was legitimate.
Hmm.
It wasn't really an
Yeah.
art form, but it served a really important function for people who would hire him, right? And so, in fact, the original essay, What I Know About Photography, was in response to the fact
Right.
that what I know about photography is very different than the theoretical side of it, which,
Mm.
over the years has changed as I've gotten more and more interested in the theoretical side. But so photography was always a method that I used to make design. However, when I started doing the photography for its own sake, the process that I did about creating the relationship between digital to analog and back to digital, I started seeing that there were strategies I could use where instead of working with just materials, which is what I generally work with, what if type was considered one of the materials I was going to use? And so, for like some covers and things that I would do, what if I took some of the words I needed and just intersected it with the materials and did photo studies just like
Mm.
I did as pure photography? But in this way, type was just one of the materials, and that actually started to work really well. And so it became this where the photo practice and the strategies in that practice started to now influence the way I look at design, at least some design, not really the book design part, but other aspects of it. And I've done some posters using this process, and some book covers to doing this process. And now I'm doing a whole series of illustrations that use this process to go within a
Mm.
book. So it's been a really interesting back and forth that this dialogue is working really well. One aspect of the photography that is kind of interesting to me is that I don't care about any of the individual pictures. They're all just material. To me, the individual pictures are kind of like just the text or just words. It's how they all go together. It's how they start to combine to create larger communities of images. That's what I'm interested in. And that's really a lot of what design is like, where it's a bunch of these different things. It's a combination of text and image and page, all of these things that fit together to then create an experience. And that's what I find
Mhm.
interesting in both cases, and I find that that really resonates in either direction for me.
I'm curious what you're thinking about now. What's next for you? Where do you kind of see these multiple practices going? Do you have kind of other projects that you're working on, other things that you're thinking about or kind of working on right now?
Yeah, well, okay, I'm still doing the photography, although it's one of those things that I have to kind of shoehorn it in between
Mm.
regular paying jobs, because the
Mhm.
photography doesn't really pay, at least not this kind of work, and I never did it for that reason. So, but therefore, I really, way back when you talked about how you have to kind of develop a practice where you have to make money too. Well, that's the book
Right.
design part. So this works around it. I'm always still collecting lots of materials and lots of objects and things to photograph, and so my apartment here is overflowing with material that is just waiting to be photographed. But one thing I'm starting to be interested in now is somehow working with photography and design in creating a literal language between the two. In that
Mm.
I'm doing this series that's called The New Machinery. That's a
Yeah.
lot of the black and white abstract work. But now I'm starting to think about what if I start creating manuals for the machines. So I take one and then I
Mm.
create a design project that involves taking the machine apart, looking at how the different functions, and because I just in a flea market I got these old manuals of how to service machines, how to take them apart. That's what they were for. These complex
Mm.
industrial machines. And the way the kind of whole language of the manual, I thought would be a really interesting component to work next to the images. And so I start to really dig deeper into not just the image as just a visual experience, but there becomes a text that goes alongside it. And I thought
Oh, that's
that that would
interesting.
be, yeah, I haven't done that yet, but I'm really excited about the prospects of how that might start to come together and take best advantage of both, but beginning with the photography and moving it into design as opposed to the other way around, where you have a design project and you need
Right.
photographs for it. It's the other way. And because all of these new machinery things are literally composed of parts, right? They're composed of individual photographs. There's my way of taking the machine apart. I can start doing a kind of book
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
shows all the individual images and then talk about them as components and parts for a larger thing. So that's something that I'm really excited about. But I have to find a period of free time where I can delve in
Right. Of
deeply into that.
course.
Yes, of course,
Yeah.
right. So
Yeah.
that's waiting. That's on the side burner, just ready to boil over.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. That's such a smart idea too. And I think that's a great way to kind of wrap up this conversation. This was so fun and interesting to me. I'm a big fan of your work and the way that you think about all of this. I really admire and feel like I learned a lot from. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Well, thanks, Jarrett.
This episode was recorded on October 30th, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm.